group will include people with personal experience of conversion practice, representatives from LGBTI organisations, faith communities, mental health professionals and academics, and they'll meet for the first time tomorrow, completing their work by summer, reflecting the Scottish Government's recognition of the urgency of this issue. So given the UK Government's consultation on their proposed ban ended on the 4th of February, can the Minister confirm that the UK Government's approach will be taken forward on a similarly inclusive and urgent basis?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can certainly confirm that we are taking it forward on an urgent basis. Since I took up the role responsible for LGBT+ issues, I have engaged with a wide variety of stakeholders, and that includes those who have been victims of conversion therapy. So all of the stakeholders that she listed, the Scottish Government has taken evidence for, I've equally engaged with from an England and Wales point of view.
Tom Randall, question 2, sir. Minister.
The Government is proud to support the Down Syndrome Bill, which was brought forward by my right honourable friend, the Member for North Somerset. The bill aims to tackle inequalities and ensure services and support meet the unique needs of people with Down syndrome.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the passage of the Down Syndrome Bill through Parliament. Will my honourable friend the Minister commit to consulting with people living with Down syndrome and other disabilities in the development of the guidance to ensure that their voices are heard?
Absolutely, I will. This is essential. People with Down syndrome and other disabilities, as well as their advocates, will be involved in each phase of developing the guidance. There will be a national call for evidence and a formal consultation on the draft guidance on gov.uk available to anyone who wants to share their views. We will provide details of the call for evidence shortly.
Jim Shannon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for responding, the honourable gentleman for posing the question. Further, what steps is the Minister taking in coordination with her counterpart in DCMS to promote the appearance on TV of our talented Down syndrome actors, to ensure that programmes like Call the Midwife, one of my favourites, are not one-offs and it becomes a normal life for children to see someone like them on TV and know that they can achieve their dreams too with hard work and determination?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Certainly the passage of this bill has given a platform to many people with Down syndrome, and I'm sure the honourable gentleman very much enjoyed meeting actors, models and many people with Down syndrome who just showed how much they can achieve during the parliamentary events, and we look forward to continuing to showcase that.
Minister Tyrrell of the Thames.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too would like to associate myself with the comment regarding the member for Bridge End. Mr. Speaker, a constituent recently contacted me about her struggles with the cost of living crisis. She is the sole carer of a young daughter, and after 25 years of misdiagnosis, she's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She's already struggling to make ends meet, and now her energy bills are set to triple. Last week's Spring statement said nothing about mental health and hardly mentioned disabilities, whereas Labour has a plan to ease cost of living and get 1 million more people a year mental health services. So where is the government's plan to help the millions of people like her?
Clearly this would normally be covered in different questions, but as the Mental Health Minister we do have a plan. We have a lot of investment in mental health. We have more investment going in to catch up, but we also have a mental health strategy plan that we'll be working on this year, and we will very much be making sure that we address people with bipolar in that strategy.
Anthony Higgin.
Question number 3, sir.
Mr. Speaker, this government believes the circumstances of one's birth should not determine life outcomes. We recently published our Levelling Up white paper to address regional disparities across the UK and put more money in the pockets of those who need it most. We're also bolstering the Social Mobility Commission by appointing new commissioners who will help improve public understanding of how opportunity is created and made accessible for all.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for that answer. For too long, the focus on social mobility has been on what a person looked like and not what they can offer. So can the Minister confirm at the dispatch box that we're going to consign that approach to history and instead focus on what everyday people can offer to this country and make sure they get the opportunity they deserve?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is quite right. I do agree with him. It is very much about the individual, and he will be pleased to know that this government is taking a new approach to equality which goes beyond protected characteristics of the Equality Act and also looks at socio-economic and regional disparities. And he would also have noticed that we released our strategy for racial equality, Inclusive Britain, which is actually based on some of the principles which he's referenced.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Social mobility is a laudable aim that everyone in this House agrees with, but I was shocked this week to see
Action for Children report that nearly half of children surveyed from low-income backgrounds say they worry about their families' finances. And that kind of stress will help no child do well at school and help no child succeed. We know that family finances and the ability to work is also constrained by childcare. So can she say what she's doing in her role to work across government to help family finances, particularly helping parents who need to find the cost of childcare?
Mr. Speaker, specifically within my role, I'm also a Minister in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and one of the programmes that we have is Supporting Families, a flagship programme where we have recently put in £300 million to support those families that need help the most. She would also have heard from other ministers across various departments what we have been doing on the cost of living, and I would refer to their statements in response to her question.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've seen good progress in increasing the number of girls studying STEM subjects at school, but we know that too many women drop out of STEM careers because of caring responsibilities, and that's why we recently announced we'll be starting a new scheme to help women into STEM roles after taking time out of work to care for their family, and this will help organisations recruit those who are too often overlooked because of a gap on their CV by providing employment support.
You'll remember. Oh, sorry.
Obvious labour shortages in construction. Can I encourage ministers to work with groups like Women into Construction to encourage women to take on apprenticeships and careers in engineering and construction?
My right honourable friend can consider ministers suitably encouraged. I speak as an engineer myself who also had an apprenticeship. I know how important organisations like the ones she mentioned, Women into Construction, are, and we will do everything we can to work with them and support women into apprenticeships and into engineering.
Neil Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 6, please.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Equality Act provision, including the public sector equality duty, apply to local authorities and they are legally bound to implement them. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, an independent public body, is responsible for enforcing the Equality Act 2010 across the public sector, including local authorities. And the EHRC makes its own decisions on how it exercises its functions.
Neil Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that response. Women from my Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituency and across Fife have had their coffee mornings cancelled by 5 council officers for reasons that have not been adequately explained. Does the Minister agree with me that preventing women from lawfully organising and discussing matters of importance under the protected characteristics of sex forms part of an emerging culture of women being cancelled, intimidated and silenced, and is deeply harmful? And does she further agree that all public bodies, including police services and local authorities, must observe the clear definitions set out by the Inner House of the Court of Session on the category of sex in the Equalities Act, and that an attack on one protected characteristic should be considered an attack on all protected characteristics and must be robustly challenged and cease?
Mr. Speaker, I do agree with the honourable gentleman's sentiments. I don't think it is right that women should be stopped from organising on the basis of their sex. Freedom of belief and speech are vital pillars of our democratic society, and no one should be silenced for expressing their legitimately held opinions. Like any public body in this country, the honourable member's local council must have regard to its public sector equality duty in all its functions and decision-making, including the case that he refers to. He may wish to pick the issue up with the Scottish Government, as they're responsible for education policy of the kind the group were looking to discuss, but without knowing the particular details of the case, if he writes to me, I might be able to provide more information.
Ria Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister set out, local authorities have a duty to have regard to equality in all of their work, and it's local authorities who facilitate our elections. So would the Minister agree with me that getting more information about who stands for election published might help us make sure that our electoral system is as fair and as open as it can be?
Yes, I would agree with that, and I think that local authorities do carry out this work, providing information to the electorate. But if there is something specific which she thinks that they could be doing more of, then in my capacity as local government minister, I'd be very happy to look into that.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. What urgent conversations is the Minister having with British Cycling to ensure that elite female athletes, such as Dame Laura Kenny, a 6-time Olympic medalist, and her teammates, will not lose their places and have their records broken by British Cycling's inability to uphold Section 195 of the 2010 Equality Act and implement the agreed guidance from the Sports Council Equality Group on transgender inclusion in sport, which was published in October last year?
The Honourable Lady raises a very important point. I have not had any specific discussions with British Cycling, but I'm very glad that she has raised this issue with me. I will pick up the matter with my colleagues in DCMS who look at sports guidance and see what we can do in order to provide clarity on the subject.
Question number 8, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government's flagship Startup Loans programme, delivered through the British Business Bank, has been instrumental in reducing access to finance barriers faced by all entrepreneurs, including those faced by female and minority entrepreneurs. And since the launch of the programme, around 40% of loans issued, valued at approximately £320 million, went to female entrepreneurs. Black, Asian and ethnic minority businesses have received around 20% of loans issued, valued at £160 million.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the last year, a record 140,000 women have started their own businesses. But research shows that only 1% of venture capital funding goes to businesses led by women. Will my honourable friend agree to meet with me and the Over Being Underfunded campaign, run by my constituents Sarah King and Claire Dunn, to discuss how we can better use government schemes like the Seed Enterprise and Investment Scheme to address this inequality?
The Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, Mr. Speaker, is one of 3 tax-advantaged venture capital schemes which provide tax incentives to individuals who invest in companies at various stages of growth. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving me the opportunity to talk about how it's world-leading in its generosity. And I will find out whether a minister from Bays or the Treasury is available to meet with her and her constituents on this specific issue. Thank you.
We'll help out.
And I, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Treasury recently announced £9.1 billion of support for energy customers, including a bill rebate and a council tax reduction, and continuing support for the most vulnerable households. Furthermore, a doubling of the Household Support Fund was announced in the spring statement, which again is getting help to where it is needed the most. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, can I commend the honourable member for Bridgend for his bravery and for being outspoken, and wish him all the best. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everybody. We are here to support him. Mr. Speaker, disabled charities estimate that more than double of disabled people could fall into fuel poverty this year. One of my constituents only recently told me, I stay in bed to keep warm and keep up with my energy costs. I skip meals in order to cope with my grocery cost. So will the government, will she support our Liberal Democrat call for reinstating the £1,000 of universal credit upkeep and keep in line with...
The Minister, come on, far too long.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I can assure you that I already meet regularly with very many disabled people and disabled people's organisations. I'm aware of this issue and naturally the anxiety that many will feel if living on a fixed income in respect of rising costs, and that is why the government is already acting in the way that I've set out.
Justin Mathers.
Question 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The HMPPS staff fitness testing policy was reviewed, updated and published in 2021. An equality impact assessment was undertaken in 2021, which remains a live document and is reviewed and will be updated regularly as work in this area progresses. HMPPS staff networks, diversity and inclusion experts and trade unions were fully consulted during the policy review and contributed to the equality analysis.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the reply from the Minister. He will be aware that there are concerns, particularly from the Prison Officers Association, that far more female officers are failing this test than male. Will he meet with the Prison Officers Association to discuss this issue?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful for my old friend. He takes a consistent interest in this point. I'm happy to mention that to my colleague, the Honourable Member for Louth and Horncastle, but I can confirm to him, since prison officer fitness testing resumed last July, 90% of female officers have passed at the first attempt, and none of them had failed by the third attempt.
We now come to topicals. Manira Wilson.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Inclusive Britain is our response to the report by the Independent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It sets out a groundbreaking action plan to tackle negative disparities, promote unity and build a fairer Britain for all. This includes developing a new model history curriculum by 2024, working with a panel of academics and business people to promote fairness in the workplace and developing a new national framework for how the use of police powers is scrutinised at a local level. And the measures in the action plan will help to level up the country by tackling the drivers of persistent ethnic disparities in education, employment, health and criminal justice.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that a recent survey by Pregnant Then Screwed of 27,000 parents found that about 2/3 are paying more in childcare than they are in their rent or mortgage. This is pushing many mothers out of the workforce or to work fewer hours. Does she agree that this needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency by this government if we want to keep women in the workforce in well-paid jobs?
Minister.
I do agree with the Honourable Lady that childcare is a very important issue if we want to keep women in the workplace, and we spent over £3.5 billion in each of the past 3 years on our early education entitlements, and the government continues to support families with their childcare costs.
David Do It.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Down Syndrome Bill and fully support...
Thank you. Please, will members not walk in front of other members while they're asking questions? David Do It.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Down Syndrome Bill and fully support its passage through Parliament. How will my honourable friend ensure that, from the perspective of equality, the bill will not have the unintended consequence of prioritising support for Down syndrome over other genetic and chromosomal disorders, some of which, although not as well known, are thought to be just as prevalent, if not more so, and certainly no less impactful to the families affected. For example, 22q11.2 deletion syndrome.
The Government is committed to consider the overlaps and linkages of the experience of people with Down syndrome and people with other genetic conditions, such as 22q deletion syndrome, in the development of the guidance, and the National Call for Evidence will ensure the guidance also benefits people with other genetic conditions too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I first associate myself with the warm and supportive remarks made from all across this House towards the member for Bridgend. Now, Mr. Speaker, women are bearing the brunt of the Conservative cost of living crisis. At the sharp end, as the Women's Budget Group has said, they're the shock absorbers of poverty, cutting essentials for themselves so their kids don't go without. So can the Minister inform the House of what assessment her government has made of the financial impact of the Chancellor's autumn budget last year and his spring statement last week?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I will tell the Honourable Lady is that the Treasury looks at all impacts in the round, and the financial statement which the Chancellor announced last week would have had an equalities impacts assessment, no doubt, that would have taken into account all the various measures and the impact it would have had based on protected characteristics.
Lee Stoltz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In practice, it's disappointing it did not include that analysis, and the Minister does not appear aware of the impact of her government's policies on women. So I can enlighten her, put together the 2021 autumn budget and the 2022 spring statement take £28 billion from the pockets of women over the next 6 years. That's £1,000 for every woman in the country. So why is her government still refusing to impose a windfall tax to reduce bills for everyone and up to £600 for the households who need it, many of them run by women?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I simply don't recognise the figures which the Honourable Lady is putting forward. It is not right to say that we're taking money out of the pockets of women. We have put forward a spring statement and a financial package that is looking after the interests of everyone in this country, because we look after people irrespective of their sex or gender, their race, and we look at people based on socioeconomic characteristics in particular, and those who are most vulnerable or disadvantaged.
Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been fighting hard to keep body image up the agenda. The Advertising Standards Authority have closed their call for evidence. The Health Select Committee has started an inquiry into this, and the Online Harms Bill has the chance to address body image. That being said, what action has my right honourable friend taken following the Women and Equality Select Committee report, changing the perfect picture and inquiry into body image?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his continued work on this important issue. As we all know, poor body image can affect lifestyle choices, physical and mental health, and is associated with lower confidence and low aspirations. So we've been taking steps to ensure young people have the skills to keep themselves safe through our work on media literacy and understanding that the online environment is not always reflective of reality.
Jill Fairness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The manhole-plasty and so-called virginity testing are disgraceful forms of abuse against women and girls. I was therefore pleased when the government committed earlier this year to banning them. Will the Minister update the House on when this legislation will be introduced so that women and girls are protected from these inhumane practices?
Certainly, the Government is committed to safeguarding women and girls, which is why on the 18th of November 2021 we tabled an amendment to the Health and Care Bill to ban virginity testing, which passed unopposed in the House of Commons.
Cheryl Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt that our first female Prime Minister led the way by showing women that they can reach the highest office and do the job well. What steps are the government taking to encourage more women to seek elected office, and will she consider a similar accolade to the Falkland Islands and celebrate a Margaret Thatcher Day?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I personally would be very supportive of a Margaret Thatcher Day, but I think that is probably more a question for the Prime Minister than for myself. But my honourable friend will know that all parties actually do quite a lot to support women into elected office, and I think that that's something that we can agree across the House is a very important thing to continue.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. Now we start with questions to Prime Minister Gareth Davis.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will have read the statement today from my honourable friend, the member for Bridgend. And I know that the House stands with you and will give you the support that you need to live freely as yourself. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Donna Ockenden and her whole team for the compassionate approach she's taken throughout this distressing review of maternity care at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospitals NHS Trust. Every woman giving birth has the right to a safe birth, and my heart, therefore, goes out to the families for the distress and suffering that they've endured. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will be making an oral statement this afternoon setting out the government's response. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While our focus is rightly on Ukraine, the Prime Minister will be aware of the great concern many people have across the Baltic states. So can he outline the role the Joint Expeditionary Force can play in countering Russian aggression and improving defensive posture for our allies in the Baltics?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and the Joint Expeditionary Force, or the JEF, is an increasingly important grouping of the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, the Dutch and ourselves, who are committed to working together in an active way to counter Russian aggression and to support our Ukrainian friends. And we had a very successful meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we'll have further such meetings in the course of the next few weeks.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by joining the Prime Minister in his remarks in relation to the honourable member for Bridgend? Does the Prime Minister still think that he and the Chancellor are tax-cutting Conservatives?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly do, because I certainly do, because this is the government that has just introduced not only the biggest cut in fuel duty ever, but the biggest cut in tax for working people in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker. 70% of the population paying national insurance contribution will have a substantial tax cut as a result of what the Chancellor did. And if you take together, they don't like it, Mr. Speaker, it's true. They always put up taxes. That's why. We cut taxes. They love it. They love putting up taxes. But if you take together what we're doing with income tax and national insurance, it's the biggest tax cut proposed by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for 25 years.
Keir Starmer.
Cut the nonsense and treat the British people with a bit of respect.
let me take him through this slowly. 15 tax rises, the highest tax burden for 70 years. For every £6 they're taking in tax rises, they're only handing £1 back. Prime Minister, is that cutting taxes or is that raising taxes?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where he's been for the last 2 years, but even by the standards of yes, he has. Even by the standards of Captain Hindsight, Mr. Speaker, to obliterate the biggest pandemic for the last century from his memory, to obliterate the $408 billion that we've had to spend to look after people up and down the country is quite extraordinary. And this is a government that is getting on with reducing the tax burden wherever we can. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, there's one measure I think he should be supporting, and that's the health and care levy, Mr. Speaker, to fund our NHS. That's the one they oppose, Mr. Speaker. Every other tax rise, they're all in favour of.
Starmer. Mr. Speaker, I can only hope that his police questionnaire was a bit more convincing than that. This year, British people face the worst fall in living standards on record. While they're counting every penny, the Prime Minister is hitting them with higher taxes. But in 2024, when there just so happens to be a general election, they will introduce a small tax cut. That's not taking difficult decisions. It's putting the Tory re-election campaign over and above helping people pay their bills. How did he find a Chancellor as utterly cynical as he is?
Prime Minister. What we have, Mr. Speaker, is a Chancellor who took the tough decisions to look after the UK economy throughout the pandemic, who protected people up and down the land with £408 billion worth of support, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, if we listen to them, if we listen to Captain, this is the truth. If we listen to Captain Hindsight, we would not have come out of lockdown in July last year, Mr. Speaker. We would have stayed in lockdown over Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, with the result that the UK economy would not be growing in the way that it is, and so we would not be able to make the investments that we now are. And under Labour, we would have to tax more and borrow more, and they cannot be trusted, Mr. Speaker, with the economy.
Keir Starmer. The tough decisions. Give me a break. We know, Mr. Speaker, we know who those two always ask to pay. Income stealth tax, a tax on working people. Tuition fee raid, a tax on working people. National insurance hike, a tax on working people. All while oil and gas companies see unexpected bumper profits. A windfall tax would raise billions and ease the burden on working people. Mr. Speaker, the former CEO of BP, Lord John Brown, says a windfall tax is justifiable. The current CEO says they have, in his words, more cash than they know what to do with. Why is the Prime Minister more interested in shielding oil and gas profits than supporting working people?
Mr. Speaker, it's a classic example of what Labour has got wrong in their period in office. The oil and gas companies are now investing £20 billion, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that we have long-term energy supplies. And I remember the 1997 Labour manifesto actually said that there was no economic case for more nuclear power. We are now having to make good the historic mistakes of the Labour Party by investing in our long-term energy supply. That is what we're doing. Everything that they are proposing would mean deterring investment, meaning higher prices for consumers and households up and down the land being worse off.
Speaker, there we have it. They're the party of excess oil and gas profits. We're the party of working people. Mr. Speaker, talking of parties, Prime Minister, he told the House no rules were broken in Downing Street during lockdown. The police have now concluded there was widespread criminality. The Ministerial Code says that ministers who knowingly mislead the House should resign. Why is he still here?
Hang on a minute. He's just changed his position. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we do at least expect some consistency from this human weather vane. It was only a week or so ago where he was saying that I shouldn't resign. He's got to make what is his position, Mr. Speaker? The investigators must get on with their job. But in the meantime, In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we are going to get on with our job. And what we are focusing on is tackling the cost of living, helping people through the spike in fuel prices, the 9.1 billion that the Chancellor has set out, but also, Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned nuclear power, I've mentioned tackling our energy supplies, which Labour totally failed to deal with. What we're also doing, far more important perhaps even than that, Mr. Speaker, we're tackling illiteracy and innumeracy in our schools. And I think we're investing billions in tutoring, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're focusing on, and I think that's what the people of this country want us to focus on.
Keir Starmer.
Look, there are only two possible explanations. Either he's trashing the Ministerial Code, or he's claiming he was repeatedly lied to by his own advisers and that he didn't know what was going on in his own house and his own office. Come off it. He really does think that it's one rule for him and another rule for everyone else. That he can pass off criminality in his office and ask others to follow the law. That he can keep raising taxes and call himself a tax cutter. That he can hike tax during a cost of living crisis and get credit for giving a bit back just before an election. When is he going to stop taking the British public for fools?
Mr. Speaker, this is the leader of the opposition who would have kept this country in lockdown and made it absolutely impossible. He has zero consistency on any issue, Mr. Speaker. But one thing we know about is he would like to take us back into the EU and take us back into lockdown if he possibly could. Thanks to what this government has done, we have unemployment back down to the levels it was before the pandemic. The economy bigger than it was. We have record vacancies, Mr. Speaker. The difference between them and us is they want to keep people, Mr. Speaker, they want to keep people on benefits. We want to help people into work. And that's what we're doing in record numbers. They want to raise taxes. We want to cut taxes. And that's what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. And we're tackling illiteracy. They didn't give a damn, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with making this country the best place to invest. Last time I updated the House, Mr. Speaker, on the number of unicorns that we had of unicorns in this country. That's tech countries worth more than $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. I said we had 100. I can inform you now, Mr. Speaker, that we now have 120. They don't want to hear it, but let me tell you, that's more than France, that's more than Germany, that's more than Israel, it's more than France, Germany, Israel combined, Mr. Speaker. That's what's happening under this government. That's what's happening because of the tough decisions we've taken. We take the tough decisions, we deliver, they play politics, Mr. Speaker.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government's work connecting rural areas like Brecon and Radnorshire to superfast broadband is going to become a lot harder tomorrow when the Welsh Government withdraws its matched funding for the scheme, forcing the cost for installation back onto homes and businesses in my constituency. Welsh Labour's decision means that my constituents will lose out as local authorities in England continue to fund the scheme. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that broadband is critical for the growth of the rural economy? And will he double his government's efforts to connect my constituents, despite Welsh Labour letting us down?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and we're spending £69 million already to support rollout of superfast broadband in Wales, and I wish that the Welsh Government had not withdrawn its broadband scheme, but we will do our best, Mr. Speaker, to make up the difference as fast as possible.
We now come to the SNP leader, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's good to see the member for Bridgend in the chamber this afternoon. I commend him for his statement earlier today. Mr. Speaker, last night, millions of families will have been desperately trying to figure out how they will possibly afford the £700 energy price hike that will hit them this Friday. Mr. Speaker, at the very same time, Tory MPs were gathering across the street for a champagne bash in the Park Plaza. We all know that the Tories partied during lockdown and now they're...
Mr. Fabricant, Easter is upon us. I don't need you to ruin your Easter. So let's hear, all of you, SNP leader Ian Blackford.
Can shout and scream when we're raising the Tory cost of living crisis, Mr. Speaker. Because we all know that the Tories partied during lockdown and now they're partying through the cost of living emergency. Last week, the Chancellor got it badly wrong with the spring statement. And ever since, the Prime Minister has been busy briefing against him, saying that more needs to be done. For once, I agree with the Prime Minister. So, if the Prime Minister really believes that more needs to be done, can he tell us exactly what he will order his Chancellor to do to help the millions of families who are facing a £700 price hike this Friday?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank him very much, and I think he's in error in what he says about events last night, but he is, like me, a living testament to the benefits of moderation in all things, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure him that we are getting that this week, for instance, to get to his point, what's happening actually is that the living wage is going up again by record amounts, and thanks to what the Chancellor has done, we are putting £9.1 billion into helping people up and down the country. And what I might respectfully suggest is actually, I think the Scottish Nationalist Government, with whom, as I say, we work increasingly well, I think the thing they could focus on for the long-term prosperity of Scotland is the educational system, where I'm sad to see Scotland's once glorious record falling behind.
Ian Blackford.
What a load of absolute baloney. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is dangerously out of touch. Food banks are warning that people are having to choose their food based on whether they can afford the gas to boil it. Families are having to choose what rooms to heat or whether they can turn on the heating at all. Some in the Tory cabinet clearly believe that better weather means that they can happily sit on their hands and do nothing till next winter. They obviously don't get or don't care that in many parts of Scotland the weather will barely reach above freezing over the next week. The Chancellor thinks his £200 loan, which is forcing people into energy debt, is somehow a solution, but it clearly isn't. So before the Prime Minister and his Chancellor go off on their Easter holidays, will they at very least turn this loan into a grant and finally put some cash into people's pockets when they need it right now.
Prime Minister.
I thank him, but of course we are doing everything that we can. The 9.1 billion, the cold weather payments, and he's right to draw attention to the problem, Mr. Speaker. And we are making huge investments in supporting people right now, and another billion, by the way, through the Household Support Fund to help vulnerable families. But Mr. Speaker, when he talks about the cost of energy in Scotland, how absolutely preposterous that the Scottish Nationalist Party should still be opposed to the use of any of our native hydrocarbons in this country, with the result that we actually have to that the Europeans are importing oil and gas from Putin's Russia, Mr. Speaker. It's totally absurd. It's true.
Just for the record, it's National Party. Let's go to Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the publication of the school's white paper, one of my most important campaigns is to secure provision of quality post-16 education within the Bolsover constituency, where there is currently none. Young people in my constituency have to travel long distances at considerable cost to access their education. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can right this wrong for the young people of the Bolsover constituency and give them the education that they deserve?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I thank him very much, and he's a great champion for Bolsover and for his constituents. Free and subsidised travel is provided to Bolsover students travelling so far to two of the three excellent colleges that are going to be offering T-levels from 2023. But I will make sure that he gets a meeting with my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, to discuss further what we can do.
And David.
During the Second World War, my grandmother, like countless other people across our country, opened her home to evacuees, including 2 German Jewish boys. Over 70 years later, the British people want to shelter desperate refugees again. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to refugee families on the Ukrainian-Polish border at Medyka. Some desperately wanted to come to our country. One elderly couple told me, however, they'd been told that it was just too complicated. Now the government's own figures say the same. Paperwork is being put ahead of people. Mr. Speaker, when wealthy businessmen from over 50 countries can come to the UK visa-free, why does the Prime Minister insist that a traumatised Ukrainian mother and child must first fill out a visa form?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I'm thanking him very much, and he's right about the generosity of his country, and he's right to draw attention to his own family's generosity in this matter. Everybody, I think, is pulling together. The number of people who have come forward to offer their homes is incredible. But I really don't think that he should deprecate what the UK is offering. We've already given 25,000 people have already got visas, Mr. Speaker. We are processing 1,000 a day, and there is no limit, there is no upper limit to the number that we can take. And this is a country that has already been the most generous in taking people from Afghanistan, the 15,000 under Operation Pitting, 104,000 applications from the Hong Kong Chinese. This is a country that is overwhelmingly generous to people coming in fear of their lives from... Yes, it is, Mr. Speaker, and so is this government.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anybody involved in partnering operations over the last 10 or 20 years can fail to be humbled by the extraordinary courage and commitment of the Ukrainian people in defending their country, aided and abetted by the lethal aid from this country, of which they're all appreciative of this government and this Prime Minister being first out the door to deliver that. But would the Prime Minister agree with me that whilst others may now begin to tire, now is actually the time to double down on the aid that we give to Ukraine, that actually we might end up breaking a pretty poor Russian army and bring peace to that part of the world whilst consigning the likes of Vladimir Putin to the dustbin of history where he belongs?
Mr. Speaker, I think that is absolutely right. Thank him very much. I thank him for his own bravery in going to see for himself only the other day. But, Mr. Speaker, yes, it is right that we should double down on military defensive support in the way that we are. And by the way, can anybody imagine a Labour government, eight of whose front bench voted to get rid of our nuclear deterrent? Can you imagine? Yes, they did. Can you imagine recently? Can you imagine them doing the same? We will go on with that, Mr. Speaker. But what we will also do, and I hope we have the support of the opposition in this, is make sure that there is no backsliding on sanctions by any of our friends and partners around the world. In fact, we need now to ratchet up the economic pressure on Vladimir Putin, and it is certainly inconceivable that any sanctions could be taken off simply because there is a ceasefire, Mr. Speaker. That would be absolutely unthinkable, in my view.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Households are experiencing soaring energy costs. We're in the middle of a global climate emergency. Against this backdrop, Norway can feed energy into our national grid at a cost of £1.36 per megawatt hour. France pays 17 pence per megawatt hour. Germany, the Netherlands and Luxembourg pay nothing to feed into our group. Can the Prime Minister then explain why Scotland's renewable sector has been punished with grid connection charges of £7.36 per megawatt hour?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland's renewable sector is leading the world, and I'm grateful to all the Scottish Government for all the help and support that they are giving in developing that incredible resource in the North Sea. I think that there is also a role, by the way, for hydrocarbons as we transition, Mr. Speaker. But what we need to do is make sure that we have a grid. That enables us to take that electricity onshore and transmit it around the country. And that is what I will be setting out in the British energy security strategy, Mr. Speaker. That is the investment, the long-term investment that this country needs, and which the parties opposite completely failed to address.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, following a huge resident and parish council-led campaign, the planning application for a new mega prison in my constituency was refused. But would my right honourable friend agree that with the proposals for that site being very close to where HS2 and East West Rail cross, this is a matter of fairness, whereby communities already suffering at the hands of the construction of big state infrastructure should not be asked to take more? And will he instruct the Ministry of Justice not to appeal this planning decision?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, who is a doughty campaigner for his constituency. He's made an important point about a planning matter about which I don't think I should really comment, but I'm sure that the relevant ministers will have heard him loud and clear.
Eric Linden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the government losing an estimated £4 billion to fraud in the furlough scheme, surely the Prime Minister should have tackled that fraud, especially when, in his own party, in North Tyneside, furlough was claimed for a member of party staff, even though he continued to work.
Prime Minister.
If she's really saying, Mr. Speaker, that we should not have rolled out the furlough scheme at the speed that we did, then I think everybody in this country understands that it was a heroic thing. And I remember 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, they were yammering and clamouring for us to go faster. And we did, Mr. Speaker. We produced a fantastic scheme. And yes, fraudsters will be hunted down. We put another £100 million into tracking down fraud in this country. £23 billion a year were lost under Labour in fraud.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I was delighted to learn this week that 37 of the 39 state schools in Bracknell constituency are now graded good or outstanding. Will the Prime Minister join with me in thanking our fantastic teachers, staff, governors and pupils? And does he agree that the new Education White Paper offers a blueprint for our schools that we can all be proud of?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a fantastic white paper.
Evans.
Over 2 million tonnes of edible food is wasted on farms and factories every year, and funding was introduced in 2019 to cover the costs of getting food to charities to reach those in need. However, the Prime Minister will know his government have now cut that critical funding to zero. Mr Speaker, funding for food waste diversion helps support community projects like, for example, Three Hills Community Supermarket in Glasgow. So can the Prime Minister explain why he is ignoring calls from Feeding Britain, Good Food Scotland and Fair Share to continue this worthwhile initiative and instead cutting off a lifeline to those struggling with the cost of living crisis?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. I think he's referring to the strategy that we have for food waste. As far as I know, we continue to support it, but I will be happy to update him by letter.
Lucy Allen.
Very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his earlier remarks concerning the Donna Ockenden report into avoidable maternity deaths and injuries at the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust. The report makes for devastating reading, the more so because women's voices were ignored. Absolutely. My constituent Hayley Matthews begged staff for a C-section throughout her 36-hour labour, but was forced into a natural birth. Her son Jack arrived blue and floppy, and within hours of his birth he tragically died. Will the Prime Minister join me in offering heartfelt sympathies to all the families affected, and also grateful thanks to the 1,862 women who shared their experiences with the Ockenden Review to ensure that maternity care is safer, kinder and more compassionate for the women that come after them?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her question. I think everybody will thank the women concerned for taking up the issue in the way that that they have, and will extend our heartfelt sympathies to the victims and their families for what they've suffered. It is very important that people get the answers that they deserve, Mr Speaker, but also that we have the right approach to this issue in the future. And that's why we're investing very substantially in maternity services, and also, of course, very substantially in midwives and in our NHS altogether.
Sir Chairman.
Thank you. Prime Minister, every day I hear from more and more of my Rotherham constituents who are struggling to put food on the table, to keep their lights on, to fuel their cars. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates the government's measures will only offset falling living standards by a third. This is the biggest financial squeeze since the 1950s. Prime Minister, don't blame Ukraine, don't blame COVID. This is down to your government's policies and your political choices. Sleep at night.
Well, I do agree that people are facing a very tough time at the moment, and we've got to do everything that we... I don't agree with her analysis, but I think that the causes are certainly to do with the inflationary impact of the world coming out of COVID, and the energy price spike is at the root of it. And what we are doing, Mr Speaker, is to help people with a universal credit, which we've lifted by £1,000, help people with the living wage, which is going up now by a record amount, Mr Speaker, and cutting taxes on working people in the way that we are. But of course we can't do everything, Mr Speaker, right now. And what we will do is ensure that we have a stronger economic performance, and we have people in work. And the most important thing is that we have people getting into work now in a way that wasn't possible, and certainly wouldn't have been possible if we'd stuck to the policies that were proposed by the Labour opposition. And that's why we have a strong economy, and that is the best recipe. Better to be off benefits and into work, and that's what we're doing.
Neil Clark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of my earliest campaigns was to reopen Stafford's Shire Hall, so I'm delighted that this iconic building is finally set to reopen this summer. So can I thank the government for providing £1.6 million in funding to create a hub for small businesses in the Shire Hall.
But can I also ask my honourable friend to help regenerate the rest of Stafford Town Centre and our high streets to help level up the West Midlands and support our local businesses?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her fantastic work to reopen Shire Hall. She's a passionate campaigner for Stafford, and Stafford was awarded over £14 million lately, Mr. Speaker, through the Future High Streets Fund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency has one of the highest rates of child poverty in the entire country, with too many already struggling between heating and eating. The government's recent real terms social security cut will now push even more families, children and pensioners into desperation. Does the Prime Minister agree that the biggest squeeze in household finances since records began does not come out of the blue, but is due to conservative economics and the notion that while some have the pleasure of partying, the rest of us should suffer?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely dedicated to levelling up across our entire country and making sure that we reduce poverty, and that's why I'm proud that there are now 500,000 fewer kids actually in workless households, 200,000 fewer kids, 200,000 fewer in poverty, Mr. Speaker, and 1.3 million fewer in absolute poverty. And the way we've done that, the way we've done that, Mr. Speaker, is by helping people into work. And we're going to go further, investing in more work coaches, massively increasing our training budget so that people get the skills that they need. That's our approach, Mr. Speaker, helping people by getting them into work.
Sir Robert Butland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's announcement by our serving United Kingdom judges of their withdrawal from the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal is now the right decision, and I support it, as does my right honourable friend. Does he agree with me that on this sad day for the people of Hong Kong, and at a time when the international rule of law is under unprecedented challenge, it is for us here in Britain to stand up for what is right, to be resolute in the face of tyranny, and to make sure that the international rules-based order is defended at every opportunity?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and I know how passionately he's campaigned on this issue himself, and I can tell him that, and I want to thank the judges in Hong Kong's court for everything that they've been doing, but I think that they've evidently concluded that the constraints of the national security law make it impossible for them to continue to serve in the way that they would want. I appreciate and I understand their decision. It is vital that we all continue to make our points to the Chinese, as I did in my conversation with President Xi the other day, about freedom in Hong Kong and about the treatment of the Uyghurs, and we will continue to do that.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Gas and electric prices and bills are through the roof. The just about managing are no longer managing, coming to surgeries, queuing at food banks. Last week, the government had a golden opportunity to tackle this. Why the devil didn't they take that opportunity to do something and relieve the pressure on our constituents?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the pressure that people are under, but the best thing we can do, rather than endlessly taxing more and borrowing more, is make sure that we support people through this tough time, which we are, but also ensure that we have a strong and growing economy in which we get people into work. So we're cutting the cost of energy, but we're also taking the long-term decisions, which the party opposite failed to do, to invest in our energy for the future.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, today's updated government figures show that of 28,300 applications submitted under the sponsorship scheme by people displaced in Putin's war, just 2,700 have been processed. Could my right honourable friend please tell the House how many to date of those people have actually arrived in the United Kingdom? Will he give his support to my noble friend Lord Harrington to cut through the Home Office red tape, simplify the application process and get people into the country?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're processing 1,000 a day, and I think that the country 25,000 visas have already been issued, as I just told the House, Mr. Speaker. Almost 200,000 families, homes have opened their arms to Ukrainians coming in fear of their lives, and there is no limit on the scheme, Mr. Speaker. I think we can be incredibly proud of what the UK is doing.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A cornerstone of the last Conservative manifesto was a guarantee that the basic state pension would rise by either 2.5%, the inflation rate, or earnings growth, whichever was highest. Instead, from April, the state pension will rise by less than half of the current inflation rate. How does the Prime Minister explain this abject betrayal of some of the most vulnerable people in our communities who are squeezed by rocketing energy and food prices on the one hand and the miserliness of this government on the other?
Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, what we've done is, through the triple lock, protected pensioners so that their incomes as a result of the triple lock are £720 higher than they would have been if we just relied on inflation. As it is, their incomes continue to increase with inflation, and they've gone up, Mr. Speaker, faster and further than those who are in work. We look after elderly people, and we always will.
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Foreign Secretary agreed that we needed to expand our soft power capabilities in these uncertain times, and yet the government is imminently about to make a funding decision that may see the closure of British Council country operations and a reduction in its international footprint. Will the Prime Minister now intervene to ensure this doesn't happen, given that I know he understands and appreciates the important work the Council does?
Prime Minister. I'm very happy to meet my honourable friend on this issue, and he's campaigned on it many times. But I can tell him that the British Council, for which I have a huge regard, has received massive grant and indeed loans to allow them to continue their activities.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You'll forgive me if I may start, but given the Prime Minister's preferences for both fancy castles and Peppa Pig, he's very welcome to come and visit Zog Playland at Warwick Castle this week. In Warwick and Leamington, as across the country, cost of living crunch is really serious. Energy bills, as we've heard, looking to double by the end of this year. Yeah. Food up 10 to 15% by year end. Fuel already 22% up year on year. It must be hard for the Prime Minister to stay in touch with financial reality, given that donors and friends pay for flights and holidays and many of his bills. And we also have a $200 million man chancellor, a $200 million chancellor who's so out of touch, he's contactless. Mr. Speaker, the public believes...
You will be sitting down, so please. I hope we've come to the end of the question. Prime Minister.
So out of touch is contactless. Mr. Speaker, the public believes the government...
Shut up and be quiet. Behave yourselves. I hope that's the end of the question. I think the Prime Minister got the gist of it, because I certainly have. Prime Minister.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, much as I admire his style, I think it'd be better as a sort of light essay in The Guardian. What we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is tackling the cost of living by dealing with the spike in energy prices and making sure that we take the right long-term decisions to take this country forward, which right decisions that party opposite completely shirked.
Len Saxby.
And I welcome what this government is doing to help where it can with the cost of living crisis. But in North Devon and across the South West, we have a housing crisis that needs urgent action. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to better understand the severity and complexity of our housing shortage and potential steps the government may take?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and she's right about the need to provide local homes for local people. And we totally understand that, and I'm very, and that's why we're building a record number of homes, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in spite of all the difficulties that we faced, and that's why we've introduced higher rates of stamp duty on second homes, Mr. Speaker, remove the second homes discount, and we're using 11.5 billion to build 180,000 affordable homes across the country. It is always the Conservatives who build affordable homes. It's true, and it's Labour who talk about it.
Final question, Sir Olney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, it emerged there had been an oil spill in Beverley Brook, a river which flows through Richmond Park to the Thames. Black waste oil and iridescence can now be seen along 13 kilometres of the watercourse, posing a serious threat to the fish and local wildlife. The Environment Agency are investigating, but they are understaffed and underfunded, while also battling against water companies over sewage discharge. Will the government commit to strengthening the powers of the Office for Environmental Protection, as the Lib Dems tried to do through the Environment Bill, so that it is able to hold the government and other public authorities to account over environmental damage in the same way the European Commission was able to?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
I know what's behind her question, Mr. Speaker. It's a desire to return to the jurisdiction of the European Union. What we want to do is make sure that we use our landmark Environment Bill to continue to improve the quality of our rivers, and that's what we're doing.
We'll just let the chamber clear before we start the statement.
A statement on the Ockenden report. This independent review was set up in 2017 in response to concerns from bereaved families about maternity at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust. Its original scope was to cover the cases of 23 families, but since it began, sadly, many more families have reported concerns. Due to this tragically high number of cases, and the importance of this work to patient safety, early conclusions were published in an initial report in December 2020. We accepted all of the recommendations from this first report, and the NHS is now taking them forward. Today, the second and final report has been published. This is one of the largest inquiries relating to a single service in the history of the NHS, looking at experiences of almost 1,500 families from 2000 to 2019. I'd like to update the House on the findings of this report and then turn to the actions that we are taking as a result. This report paints a tragic and harrowing picture of repeated failures in care over 2 decades, which led to unimaginable trauma for so many people. Rather than moments of joy and happiness, for these families, their experience of maternity care was one of tragedy and distress. And the effects of these failures were felt across families, communities, and generations. The cases in this report are stark and deeply upsetting. Of 12 cases where a mother had died, the report concludes that in 3/4 of those cases, the care could have been significantly improved. It also examined 44 cases of HIE a brain injury caused by by oxygen deprivation. 2/3 of these cases featured significant and major concerns in the care provided to the mother. And the report says from almost 500 cases of stillbirth, 1 in 4 were found to have major concerns in maternity care, which, if managed appropriately, might or would have resulted in a different outcome. When I met with Donna Ockenden last week, she told me about basic oversights at every level of patient care, including one case where important clinical information was kept on post-it notes, which were then swept into the bin by cleaners, with tragic consequences for a newborn baby and her family. In addition, there were repeated cases where the Trust failed to undertake serious incident investigations, and where investigations did take place, they didn't follow the standards that would have been expected. These persistent failings continued as late as 2019, and multiple opportunities to address them were ignored, including by the Trust Board, who were accountable for these services. Reviews from external bodies failed to identify the substandard care that was taking place, and some of the findings gave false reassurances about maternity services at the Trust. The CQC only rated maternity services inadequate for safety in 2018, which is unacceptable given the huge deficiencies in care that are outlined in this report. The report also highlights serious issues with the culture within the Trust. For instance, 2/3 of staff were surveyed and reported that they had witnessed cases of bullying, and some staff members withdrew their cooperation with the report within weeks of publication. The first report already concluded, and I quote, that there was a culture within the Trust to keep caesarean rates below because they were perceived as the essence of good maternity care, end quote. And today's report adds that, and I quote again, many women thought any deviation from normality meant a caesarean section was needed, and this was then denied to them by the Trust. Mr. Speaker, it is right that both the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Royal College of Midwives have said recently that they regret their campaign for so-called normal births. It is vital that across maternity services that we focus on safe and personalised care where the voice of the mother is heard throughout. The report shows a systemic failure to listen to families affected, many of whom had been doggedly persistent in raising issues over several years. One mother said that she felt like a lone voice in the wind. Bereaved families told the report that they were treated in a way that lacked sensitivity and empathy, and appallingly, in some cases, the Trust blamed these mothers for the trauma that they had been through. In the words of Donna Ockenden, the Trust failed to investigate, failed to learn, and failed to improve. We entrust the NHS with our care, often when we are at our most vulnerable. In return, we expect the highest standards. I've seen with my own family the brilliant care the NHS maternity services can offer. But when those standards are not met, we must act firmly, and the failures of care and compassion that are set out in this report have absolutely no place in the NHS. To all the families that have suffered so greatly, I am sorry. The report clearly shows that you were failed by a service that was there to help you and your loved ones to bring life into this world. We will make the changes that the report says are needed at both a local and national level. Mr. Speaker, I know that honourable members and those families who have suffered would want reassurances that the individuals who are responsible for these serious and repeated failures will be held to account. I'm sure that the House will understand that it is not appropriate for me to name individuals at this stage. However, I'd like to reassure honourable members that a number of people who were working at the Trust at the time of the incidents have been suspended or struck off from the professional register, and members of senior management have also been removed from their posts. There is also an active police investigation, Operation Lincoln, which is looking at around 600 cases. Given that this is a live investigation, I'm sure that honourable members will recognise that I'm not able to comment further on that. Today's report recognises that since the initial report was published in 2020, we have taken important steps to improve maternity care. This includes £95 million of maternity services across England to boost the maternity workforce, to fund programmes for training, development and leadership. The second report makes a series of further recommendations. It contains 66 for the local trust, 15 for the wider NHS, and 3 for me as Secretary of State. The local trust, NHS England, and the Department of Health and Social Care will be accepting all 84 recommendations. Earlier today, I spoke to the Chief Executive of the Trust, who was not in the post during the period that was examined by this report. I made it clear how seriously I take this report and the failures that were uncovered, and I reinforced that the recommendations must be acted on promptly. But as the report identifies, there are wider lessons that must also be learned, and it contains a series of actions that should be considered by all trusts that provide maternity services. I've asked NHS England to write to all of these trusts, instructing them to assess themselves against these actions, and NHS England will be setting out a renewed delivery plan that reflects these recommendations. I'm also taking forward the specific recommendations that Donna Ockenden has asked me to put in place. The first is the need to further expand the maternity workforce. Just a few days ago, the NHS announced a £127 million funding boost for maternity services across England. This will bolster the maternity workforce even further, and it will also fund programmes to strengthen leadership, retention and capital for neonatal maternity care. Second, we will take forward the recommendation to create a working group independent of the Maternity Transformation Programme, with joint leadership from the Royal College of Midwives and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists. Finally, Donna Ockenden said that she endorses the proposals that I announced in January to create a special health authority to continue the maternity investigation programme that is currently run by the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. And again, we will take her proposals forward, and the SHA will start its work from April next year. I would like to thank Donna Ockenden and her whole team for the forensic and compassionate approach that she has taken throughout this distressing inquiry. This report has given a voice at last to those families who were ignored and so grievously wronged, and it provides a valuable blueprint for safety and safe maternity care in this country for years to come. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to pay tribute to the families whose tireless advocacy was instrumental to this review being set up in the first place. I cannot imagine how difficult it must have been for them to come forward and to tell their stories. And this report is a testament to the courage and the fortitude that they have shown in the most harrowing of circumstances. Mr. Speaker, this report is a devastating account of bedrooms that are empty, families that are bereft, and loved ones taken before their time. We will act swiftly so that no families have to go through the same pain in the future. I commend this statement to the House.
Just before we start, what I would say is the quite right, the Secretary of State, is a very important statement has gone over. So I would offer the plump bench 6 minutes. We come to Shadow Minister Farrell Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. I'm pleased to be able to respond to this statement today, not just as the Shadow Minister for Patient Safety, but as a woman and as a new mother. I would like to thank Donna Ockenden and her team for this report. I would like to thank the families that have come forward. We would not be here today without the persistence and the resilience they have shown for over 20 years in their fight for justice. Today marks an important milestone for hundreds of families who have been seeking justice. The Ockenden report lays bare the harrowing truth of what those families had to face and why their fight for justice has been such a fierce one. Cries for help going unheard. Parents having to try and resuscitate their own children because there was no one there to help. Women and babies dying needlessly because they simply were not listened to. That women were silenced and ignored at their most vulnerable when they were relying on the NHS to keep them safe is shameful. No woman should ever have to face going into hospital to give birth and not know whether she and her baby will come out alive. These were not just one-off or isolated incidents of negligence. This was the institutional failure of a system which failed to take up the many opportunities to realise that it had a serious problem. We are where we are today because of the persistence and the resilience of those families and their refusal to give up the fight to expose those failings. And the only comfort we can offer them is that their voices have been heard and that we commit today across this House to ensure these failings are never repeated. For far too long, patient safety issues and the voices of women have been an afterthought in health, leading to the kind of crisis we saw in Shrewsbury. This needs to change. Patient safety must be a priority for both health professionals and ministers. So today I welcome that the Secretary of State has committed to the local actions for learning for Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust in full and all the immediate and essential actions on the wider system. So will the Secretary of State come to this House later on this year to update on the progress being made on these actions? The report makes clear that you cannot run a safe service without a culture of transparency and accountability. So, will the Secretary of State set out how he intends to ensure an open culture within the health service with the willingness to learn within maternity services and for future failings to be identified far more quickly? Underpinning issues in maternity care, as is the case across so much of our NHS, is workforce. Only 10 months ago, as a first-time mother, I experienced just how stretched to the limits maternity services are. The NHS now is losing more midwives. It's losing midwives faster than it can actually recruit them. Yep, that's right. A recent CQC survey shows that almost a quarter of women were unable to get help when they needed during labour. Hundreds of pregnant women were turned away from maternity wards last year because there were not the staff available to care for them. So can the Secretary of State tell the House what he's doing to ensure the NHS recruits the midwives it needs and what he is doing to keep the midwives we have in post? It's only with the necessary workforce that the NHS will be able to ensure women receive the care that meets their needs and prioritises their safety. That security and respect is all that the families who suffered so much at Shrewsbury want, and all that the women who put their and their babies' lives in the hands of NHS want. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We now come to the Secretary of State. We now come to the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Lady for her remarks? And it's not often we get to say this in this chamber, but I agree with her wholeheartedly and what she just shared with the House. She's right to talk about this as a fight for justice, and she's right to point to had these brave families not come forward and been so persistent in coming forward with what had been done to them, what had gone wrong, this inquiry may never have happened, and she's absolutely right to say that, but also to talk about institutional failure at this trust, and the first report set that out in some detail, and today we're seeing that in much more detail. She talked rightly about patient safety, and she will know that the government has already set out plans to appoint a patient safety commissioner, and that particular appointment will be made soon, but we need to do much more than that. And that is why, with the interim report, it was absolutely right to accept all the recommendations, including the immediate and urgent actions that were needed. I think in that report, the interim report, there were 7 of those and 27 local actions. And I can also tell her and the House that the Trust has implemented all of those actions from the interim report. That was then backed by the £95 million of extra funding at the time. And then also, as I said a moment ago, the recommendations in this final report, many more recommendations, quite rightly so, that they have all been accepted and backed by at least £127 million of funding. Much of that will go to workforce. When it comes to workforce also, I think it's also worth saying, because she's right about the need to increase the size of the workforce, especially in terms of midwives, that when it comes to acceptances for student nurses and midwives, it's at the last year's acceptances, I think, were the highest that the country had seen in decades, but clearly there's much more to do.
Come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's report goes beyond my darkest fears. When I commissioned it as Health Secretary in 2016, I was approached by 23 families, and we hear today that over 200 babies might be alive today if better care had been provided. I want to thank Donna Ockenden and her team for an incredibly thorough investigation, and I also want to thank the Health Secretary for his compassionate and comprehensive response to the House today. Donna Ockenden doesn't use the word recommendation. She talks about immediately essential actions. So can I ask him what is his deadline by when all those actions will be implemented? Because that is something that every expectant mother in the country desperately wants to know. Can I gently say to him that whilst I warmly welcome more midwives and more doctors, it is not consistent to do that and to vote down the amendment from the House of Lords today on the health bill, which would make sure that we never had those shortages again. And can I too finally pay tribute to Richard and Rhiannon Stanton-Davis, Kayleigh and Colin Griffiths. Richard and Rhiannon came to talk to me about their daughter Kate, who died in 2009. Colin and Kayleigh's daughter Pippa died in 2016 when I was Health Secretary. And because of the blame culture and the culture of fear in the NHS, it was left to them and many other families to fight for justice. Can this be the last time that we put that burden on the shoulders of bereaved families and build a culture in the NHS which is open, transparent, accepts things go wrong, but hungry to learn from mistakes so that we never again repeat tragedies?
Yes. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I agree very much with my right honourable friend, and I want to acknowledge that ultimately this report took place because of his decision to ask Donna Ockenden to do this independent review. But he's right that he, in turn, did that because of the bravery of families that had come to see him, especially Rhiannon Davies and Richard Stanton and Kayleigh and Colin Griffiths. And of course, there are many other families. He's absolutely right to say that. He's in his question about the immediate and essential actions. With the interim report, there were 7 such actions. The Trust has implemented all of those across the NHS. They either are fully or partially implemented. With this report, there are also such actions recommended, and the implementation of that has already begun. Of course, we've just received the report, but I have asked for a timetable by when that will be done, and I want to see that done as quickly as possible. And then also his point about workforce is very important, and I hope that he welcomes that for the first time the NHS has been asked to set out a 15-year workforce plan.
Ellen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to join my honourable colleagues across the House and start by thanking all of the families who've bravely come forward to share their experiences. In particular, Kaylee, Colin, Rhiannon and Richard, whose persistence have led to this review, and I hope that women and babies across Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin and the UK will be safer in the future as a result of their bravery. I'd also like to thank Donna Ockenden and her team for their thoroughness in reviewing so many tragic cases. I'm sure the Secretary of State will agree with me that this can never be allowed to happen again, and that the deaths of these 201 babies must not be in vain. This must be a turning point for maternity services in England. Donna Ockenden has endorsed the findings of the Health and Social Care Select Committee and recommended that an immediate investment of £200 to £350 million an annum is required to keep women safe. So I welcome the Secretary of State's guarantees that the immediate and essential actions will be implemented, but I'd like to ask him whether he'll be able to commit the additional resources recommended by Donna Ockenden today. Thank you.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments and assure her that her constituents, those throughout Shropshire, Telford and the Wrekin, will be safer as a result of those brave families coming forward and this report, and indeed families across England. And when it comes to resources, the Honourable Lady would have heard me talk about the 95 million that was given at the time of the interim report, plus another 127 million given in the last few days for maternity services, and we will keep that under review.
Lucy Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too would like to thank the Secretary of State for his very welcome statement today. I'd also like to thank Minister Caulfield for her work in this area, which has been excellent. I want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for South West Surrey, for everything he has done for patient safety. He has led the way, and I'm so grateful to him for this. Does my right honourable friend believe that what we have seen at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust is indicative of a culture where senior management were unaccountable, where no one felt responsible, where failings were minimised, where poor care was normalised, and where women's voices were not heard? And will he do everything he can to increase accountability of senior management across the NHS so that institutional blindness, as we have seen here, can never again cause such harm to those who put their trust in the NHS?
Secretary of State.
Can I first just thank my honourable friend for her approach and her role in helping to make this report happen, and how she's worked with me and ministers in my department on this most important of issues. She's right to talk about the importance of culture, especially where it is absolutely clear from this report that the voices of women were not heard. Time and time again, they were not heard. And I want to reassure her that we will implement all the recommendations in this report, but even broader than that, when it comes to women's voices, that will be at the heart of the upcoming women's health strategy.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is an important day for maternity safety, and we rightly pay tribute to the families directly affected, so many of whom have given evidence to the Ockenden Review. I want to quote James Titcombe, who lost his baby son Joshua during the Morecambe Bay maternity scandal. He said one of the most harmful experiences for the Morecambe Bay families was seeing influential people in the maternity world diminish the findings of the investigation report. I join James Titcombe in saying we must not allow that to happen with this report, and I urge the Secretary of State to ensure instead that the bereaved families should be allowed a process of truth, reconciliation and healing, instead of any denial of the truth of what happened.
Secretary of State.
I agree with the Honourable Lady, and she's right to raise the importance of the Morecambe Bay investigation, where I believe the report was completed in 2015, and there were 44 recommendations from that. I know that some of those recommendations, that 18 that were specifically for the Trust, have all been implemented, and there were 26 for the wider NHS that are being implemented.
Elipta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for both the tone and the substance of his response to this devastating report today, and also to add my voice to the consensus across the House that the way this is being handled is utterly vital, and we must make sure that the NHS does take on board Donna Ockendon's recommendations. She and her team of over 90 experienced clinicians are properly being thanked for the work they've done. They painstakingly reviewed these cases going back some 20 years, and it must have been harrowing for them, as of course it has been for all the families so tragically affected who've had to relive their tragedy. In particular, I'd like to praise the courage and tenacity of Rhiannon Stanton-Davis and Richard Davis, who were my constituents when they lost their baby Kate in truly awful and tragically avoidable circumstances. It was they who kept pressing for answers from Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust, and which led me to take them to see my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey South West, when he was Health Secretary, who agreed to launch this review 5 years ago. They are no longer my constituents, and I understand they're now keen, understandably, to focus their attention on their family, having been living with this trauma since 2009. I have some questions for the Secretary, if I may. Does my right honourable friend recognise that the Ockenden Review has raised fundamental questions for maternity services across the NHS over the culture of so-called normal birth, and how a focus on targets under successive governments rather than patient outcomes can distort clinical best practice and tragically patient safety? And from his discussion with the current Chief Executive that he touched on in his remarks, is he satisfied that the current management and clinical teams at SATH have accepted the local actions for learning made by the initial Ockenden report and are committed to study and implement rapidly all further recommendations specific to this trust? And finally, what reassurance can he give to the thousands of expectant mothers in Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin that the maternity services there are safe and that patient safety is paramount?
State.
First, can I thank my honourable friend for the way he has also worked with my department and my predecessor, representing his constituency the way he has throughout this investigation. He's talked about the so-called normal birth, and he's right to use to say so-called, because really, Mr. Speaker, the only normal birth is a safe birth, and that is what the NHS should be working to, and that clearly did not happen in this trust, and this report has made that absolutely clear. But just as importantly is to set out a number of recommendations, including for my honourable friend's local NHS trust, and I can absolutely reassure him, including from my conversation earlier today with the current Chief Executive, that the recommendations from the interim report have all been implemented by his local trust, and the ones that are in this report have all been accepted.
Tammy?
Mr. Speaker, can I start by paying tribute to all the families affected, and also to thank Donna Ockenden and her team for her recommendations. Mr. Speaker, more midwives are leaving the profession than joining it, and so we cannot run equally safe services across all NHS trusts without the appropriate staffing levels. And so I hope the Secretary of State will be able to outline in further details what the government is doing to ensure that we have safe staffing levels across all NHS trusts in order to provide care for pregnant women.
State.
The Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker, is right to talk about the importance of having the right workforce, certainly more midwives. I can tell her that last year there were 30,185 acceptances for nursing and midwifery courses, the highest in a decade. And also, in terms of recruitment, supported by some of this extra funding I've talked about today, the government has put in place grants for students to take on courses, and also, where appropriate, focus on international recruitment too.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This courageous report today is clear that keeping caesarean section rates artificially low contributed to babies dying. I'm pleased that, following a recommendation from the Cross-Party Health and Social Care Committee, NHS trusts are no longer being assessed on performance for their caesarean rates. But will the Secretary of State go further? Will he ensure that we look at where caesarean section rates remain artificially low in trusts? So this dangerous normal birth ideology is eradicated from the NHS once and for all?
Yeah. Show State.
Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes.
Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I would also like to pay tribute to the families in what is truly a shocking report. But could I ask the Secretary of State, in addition to the issues identified around the culture within this particular trust, and I'm sorry I haven't gone into all the recommendations, are there recommendations in terms of governance for boards? Boards have a key role in holding their executives to account. And will he, on that point, be writing to boards to make them aware of their responsibilities about that? And could I also ask the Secretary of State what the implications are for the national clinical audit of the confidential inquiries into maternal and infant deaths? Thank you.
Show State.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the latter part of her question, the national clinical audit, if she may, I'll write to her about that. On her important point about boards, she is right. The report does, this final report does talk about the importance of boards and properly making sure that the people on the boards are vetted, but also they understand their responsibilities and have the information that they need to carry out their responsibilities. And also, it's my understanding, I think in 2014 or thereabouts, the CQC also changed the rules around board members for NHS Trust, requiring them to meet a new fit and proper test.
Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is impossible to think about these lost babies, lost lives, and damaged families without getting really upset and then very, very angry. But the work I've been doing with midwives and families, mums and dads, in the last 6 months or so, shows me that this is not just one trust. We had thousands of midwives marching on the streets. We had the pandemic where mums were taken to social media feeling really marginalised and their voices not heard. But midwives are telling me they haven't wanted to speak out before because they don't want to frighten the mums and dads in their charge, and that's why they often feel that they're not heard themselves. So how is we've got to help them, because how is the NHS and the government going to reassure pregnant women and help the midwives reassure pregnant women, given all of this in the news at the moment? And how can we prevent other maternity services failing?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raised a very important point. There are hundreds of thousands of births in the NHS delivered through the NHS each year, and the vast majority of them are completely safe, as I found for myself and many honourable members in this House, including my honourable friend. But what we've heard about today is when it goes wrong and goes tragically wrong, but especially when it was avoidable. That's the point, when it was avoidable. And she's right to talk about the importance of other trusts in this. This is focused on one trust, but we know already that there was a problem in Morecambe Bay. We know there's an investigation going on in East Kent at the moment as well, an independent investigation. And so this is, there's action for all trusts, and that's why I think it's very important that the NHS acts on the recommendations for the wider NHS, and I act on the recommendations for my department, and we will certainly be doing that, and so will the NHS.
Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. Not one person could help but be moved by the account and by his sincerity in dealing with this horrific situation. I also want to commend all involved in the Ockenden report for their work on this issue. Our hearts break for the little babies, the mums, the dads and the family units who have been impacted by these horrendous practices, and today we remember and commend the bravery of the families of those who had the courage to speak out. Given the findings and the negative cloud that will be over all of those who work in maternity services, will the Secretary of State take this opportunity to thank those maternity teams right throughout this United Kingdom who day and daily bring new life into this world in a compassionate and professional manner? I think of the wonderful services in my own constituency of Upper Bann, in Craigavon Area Hospital, and I know today they will be saddened by what they're hearing in terms of this report, so I trust that you can commend them for the work that they do.
I will warmly join the Honourable Lady in thanking and commending the work of maternity teams throughout the United Kingdom, what they do day in, day out, especially over the last 2 years with the pandemic, probably making it even harder than normal. And I know that many of those working with technology will, indeed all of them, will welcome this report because they will want to see the very changes that are set out in this report.
Jill Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank the families for shining a spotlight on this. One of my children suffered from oxygen deprivation at birth, from what I now know were failings in my care. I was lucky though in my third pregnancy. Sheer fluke, the GP practice I was registered with had a wonderful community midwife. She was with me through my pregnancy, she was with me at the birth of my daughter, and she took care of me afterwards. I was listened to, I was supported, and I felt safe. Whilst I thank my right honourable friend for taking on board these recommendations, would he